In September 2003, a 33-year-old man from Guadalajara walked into the ring at T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas and was beaten by a fighter most of the boxing world had considered a significant step below his level. The fight lasted 12 rounds. The judges gave it to the other man on a majority decision. The man who lost had, in the previous 5 years, been called the best pound-for-pound fighter on the planet by the governing bodies of professional boxing, by the major sports broadcasters, by the promotional apparatus that had built his career into the most commercially valuable individual boxing property in the sport's history. His name is Saul Alvarez Barragan. The world knows him as Canelo. And the loss to Dimitri Bivol, a loss that was sufficiently clear that the majority of ringside observers scored it the same way as the judges, did not end the conversation about whether Canelo is the greatest fighter of his generation. It restarted a conversation that had been suppressed for years by the weight of his commercial power and by the specific institutional structure of the boxing business that surrounds and depends on him. The conversation is this: is Canelo Álvarez a genuine pound-for-pound great, or is he the most elaborately constructed commercial product in the history of boxing? And is it possible to be both simultaneously? The question is not simple, and the answer is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is simple in either direction is telling you something that the record does not support. Canelo has genuine accomplishments. He has beaten genuinely good fighters in genuinely competitive fights and has displayed in those fights qualities of technical boxing skill and ring intelligence and physical toughness that the dismissal of him as a pure construction cannot account for. He has also operated within a promotional and sanctioning body environment that has, across the critical years of his career, provided him with specific structural advantages in opponent selection, in weight manipulation, in the management of the circumstances under which the fights that would have tested him most seriously were made or not made, whose cumulative effect on the historical record is something that the honest examination of the career requires confronting. The legend and the fraud are not mutually exclusive. They may be the same object examined from different angles. This documentary is going to examine Canelo Álvarez's career with the honesty that his commercial power has consistently made inconvenient. It is going to look at what he has actually done in the ring and at what he has avoided doing in the ring, and at the specific mechanisms by which the boxing business around him has shaped the record that the world is now being asked to judge as the legacy of the greatest fighter of his era. It is going to look at the Clenbuterol case and what it established and what it did not establish and what the boxing industry decided to do with it. It is going to look at the matchmaking, the selection of opponents, the management of weight classes, the specific choices about who to fight and who not to fight that the record shows with a clarity that the promotional narrative has consistently obscured. And it is going to try to answer the question that the title poses, not with a verdict, but with the specific information that the question requires. The information that makes it possible to form your own honest assessment of what Canelo Álvarez actually is, because the boxing business does not want you to form your own honest assessment of Canelo Álvarez. It wants you to form the assessment it has been constructing for 15 years. This documentary is about the distance between those two things. If the story behind the story, the matchmaking, the money, the narrative construction around a fighter who may be both genuine and manufactured simultaneously, is the kind of examination you come here for, subscribe. Boxing is one of the sports where the distance between the official account and the real one is largest. This channel lives in that distance. Saul Alvarez Barragan was born on July 18th, 1990, in Guadalajara, Jalisco, the youngest of 8 children born to Santos and Ana Maria Barragan, in a family that was poor in the specific way that large Mexican families of that era and that region were poor. Not destitute, but without margin, living in the specific economy of a household where every member's contribution mattered and where the path upward was narrow and required specific leverage. The leverage the Álvarez family had was boxing. He was not the first in the family to find it. Several of his older brothers boxed with varying degrees of seriousness and success, and the boxing environment was present in the household before Saul was old enough to train. He entered a gym at the age of 13. By the accounts of the people who trained with him and coached him in those early years, the physical gifts were apparent immediately. The speed of hand, the reflexes, the specific quality of spatial intelligence in the ring that experienced trainers identify as the thing that cannot be taught, and that instruction and conditioning can only develop once it is present. He turned professional at 15, which is legal under Mexican boxing law, and which is a practice common enough in Mexican boxing that it requires no special explanation, but which also means that his professional record includes fights against opponents whose significance as tests of his development requires significant discounting. The early professional fights, the 25 fights that accumulated his record through his mid-adolescence, were fights against opponents whose quality was consistent with the developmental function those fights were serving. The accumulation of professional experience, the refinement of technical skills, the development of the ring composure that a fighter can only build through the competitive environment of actual fights rather than through training alone. They were not tests. They were not intended to be tests. The record they produced is real in the sense that the results happened and cannot be changed, and it is misleading in the sense that the opponents and the circumstances were chosen to produce wins rather than to produce information about what the fighter actually was. The red hair, the specific physical characteristic that the promotional apparatus seized on as the distinguishing visual element of his brand, and that became, in the years of his commercial ascent, one of the most recognizable features in global boxing, is a genetic inheritance that in the context of Mexican boxing is genuinely unusual. Mexico has produced a continuous supply of world-class fighters across the past century, and the population of Mexican fighters does not produce red hair with any frequency. The specific combination of his physical distinctiveness and the genuine quality of his early performances created the conditions for a promotional narrative that was, in its early dimensions, based on something real. There was a genuinely gifted young Mexican fighter with red hair who was exciting to watch and who was winning convincingly. The narrative that was built on top of that reality, the specifics of how it was built, by whom, and in service of what commercial interests, is the more complicated story. His early career was managed and promoted by Golden Boy Promotions, the promotional company founded by Oscar de la Hoya, whose own career as a commercially constructed Mexican-American boxing star gave him a specific understanding of what the Canelo property represented and what it could be built into. De la Hoya identified in the young Álvarez the combination of genuine talent, marketable identity, and Mexican heritage that the boxing business had been successfully monetizing for generations. And he began the process of building the career with a specific combination of developmental fights that built the record and the occasional higher profile appearances that built the audience, calibrated to expand the commercial reach of the property without exposing it to the competitive risk that genuine tests would have introduced. The relationship with DAZN and later with Matchroom Boxing and Eddie Hearn brought the specific commercial structure of the Canelo property to its full expression. The 11-fight, $365 million deal that DAZN signed with Canelo in October 2018 was, at the time of its signing, the largest contract in the history of combat sports and one of the largest in the history of individual athlete contracts in any sport. $365 million guaranteed across 11 fights. The figure was extraordinary. The figure was also the specific number that the boxing business needed Canelo to be worth, because DAZN had built its entry into the American sports streaming market on the Canelo property. And because the value of the streaming platform's investment in the American market was substantially dependent on the continued commercial viability of the fighter at its center. The commercial structure created a specific incentive for DAZN, for the promotional apparatus, for the sanctioning bodies that certified his championships, for the broadcasters and analysts whose access to the boxing business was mediated through the promotional ecosystem that Canelo's commercial value sustained, to manage the narrative around him in ways that protected the investment. The narrative management is what this documentary is about. The clenbuterol case in 2018 is the moment where the narrative management became most visible and where the boxing industry's response most clearly illustrated the specific weight of the commercial interests it was protecting. Subscribe if you're not already here. What happened with that case, what was established, what was not investigated, and what the sport decided to accept is the clearest single illustration of how the machinery around Canelo operates. The Floyd-Mayweather fight in September 2013 was the fight that established the full commercial scale of the Canelo property, and that also established, for the segment of the boxing audience paying close enough attention, the specific competitive profile of what Canelo actually was at that point in his career. Mayweather was 43-0 and was, by the consensus of serious boxing analysts, the best defensive fighter of his generation and probably of the modern era. Canelo was 23 years old and had never fought anyone at Mayweather's level. The fight was made at a catchweight of 152 pounds, 2 pounds below the junior middleweight limit. A weight manipulation that the promotional apparatus justified on the basis of contractual negotiation, but that had the specific competitive effect of requiring Canelo to come in below his natural fighting weight, while Mayweather, a natural welterweight, was operating above his. The weight was a disadvantage for Canelo. He lost. He was comprehensively outboxed across 12 rounds in a way that demonstrated, for anyone evaluating the fight honestly, that he was not competitive with the best fighter in the world at that time. The loss to Mayweather was managed in the promotional narrative as a learning experience, as the defeat of a 23-year-old by a 43-fight undefeated veteran. A defeat that reflected the gap between the two fighters' levels of experience rather than a definitive competitive assessment. The narrative was not entirely dishonest. 23 is young. Mayweather's experience and defensive mastery were genuine. The specific character of the defeat, the completeness of it, the degree to which Canelo's offense was neutralized and his own defense was exposed across every round, was more comprehensively obscured by the promotional narrative than the facts of the fight warranted. The learning experience framing was applied, and the opponent's selection that followed the Mayweather loss was calibrated to rebuild the record, and the reputation without repeating the competitive exposure that Mayweather had produced. The weight class management that defines the post-Mayweather portion of Canelo's career is the element of the record that the promotional narrative has been most invested in presenting as evidence of greatness, and that the alternative reading presents as evidence of the specific kind of career management that the boxing business deploys in service of commercial rather than competitive objectives. He has fought at super welterweight, he has fought at middleweight, he has fought at super middleweight, he has fought at light heavyweight. He has, in each weight class, won championship belts from the sanctioning bodies that govern professional boxing, the WBC, WBA, IBF, WBO, and has accumulated a collection of those belts whose number and variety the promotional apparatus presents as the record of a fighter who has done what no fighter in history has done. Unify and dominate multiple weight classes. The reality of what those belts represent, the competitive quality of the opposition that produced them, the specific conditions under which the fights were made, the weight manipulations that preceded some of the biggest performances, is the reality that the alternative reading requires examining in detail. The Glovegate controversy from the 22 fight with Caleb Plant is a smaller illustration of the same pattern. In the months before the fight, footage circulated on social media appearing to show Canelo's team using gloves during training sessions in ways that the rulebook prohibits, specifically applying substances to gloves in a way that could affect their performance. The footage generated significant discussion in boxing media for approximately 72 hours and then was effectively absorbed by the promotional apparatus without consequence. No investigation was conducted by any athletic commission. No formal finding was made. The coverage moved on. The fight happened. Canelo won by 11th round TKO. The controversy produced no institutional response and left no mark on the official record. This is the specific mechanism. The media cycle absorbed, the investigation not conducted, the narrative restored, that the Canelo case has demonstrated across multiple controversies, with the clenbuterol case as its most significant expression. The clenbuterol case. In February 2018, 2 months before his scheduled rematch with Gennady Golovkin, Canelo tested positive for clenbuterol, a banned performance-enhancing substance. In drug tests administered by the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, he tested positive twice in samples collected in February. The Nevada State Athletic Commission suspended him. The rematch was postponed. His explanation was that the positive tests resulted from contaminated meat consumed in Mexico, where clenbuterol is used illegally in livestock farming, and where trace amounts occasionally appear in drug tests administered to athletes who have eaten contaminated beef. The contaminated meat defense is a real phenomenon. Clenbuterol does appear in trace amounts in contaminated beef, and athletes in multiple sports have successfully used the defense. The specific levels found in Canelo's samples, the concentrations, the timing, the pattern of the results, were subjects of genuine scientific debate among the anti-doping specialists who examined the case. WADA, which administered the tests, did not accept the contaminated meat explanation as sufficient. The Nevada Commission ultimately suspended him for 6 months, the minimum available sanction. The WBC accepted the contaminated meat explanation and imposed no sanction of its own. The rematch with Golovkin eventually took place in September 2018. Canelo won on a majority decision in a fight whose judging was widely criticized. The specific handling of the clenbuterol case by the boxing establishment, the minimum suspension from the commission, the no sanction response from the WBC, the relatively swift return to high-profile competition, the management of the narrative in the period between the positive test and the rematch reflects the specific commercial stakes that the Canelo property represented and the specific institutional incentives that those stakes created. Boxing is not the NFL or the NBA or Major League Baseball. Organizations with the institutional scale and the independent governance structures that allow for anti-doping enforcement that is not contingent on the commercial interests of individual promoters and broadcasters. Boxing's governance is fragmented among multiple sanctioning bodies whose primary revenue stream is the sanctioning fees paid by promoters for the championship fights the bodies certify, creating the specific conflict of interest that the clenbuterol case illustrated with maximum clarity. the body most responsible for certifying Canelo's championships, was financially dependent on the commercial ecosystem whose value the championships helped create. What I want to examine now is the specific fights, the ones he won, the ones he avoided, and what the pattern of both looked at together actually shows about the competitive reality of this career. Because the promotional narrative has been telling a story organized around the belts and the highlight reel knockouts and the weight class conquests. And the honest competitive analysis tells a somewhat different story, one that includes the wins, but also includes the opponents, the conditions, the weights, and the questions that the most significant avoided fights raise about what the record would look like if the career had been made differently. This is the part of the Canelo examination that the boxing media closest to the promotional apparatus has the least interest in conducting. Stay with me. The relationship with Golden Boy Promotions and its eventual fracture is the business chapter of the Canelo career that the promotional narrative prefers to present as a simple maturation story. The young fighter outgrowing his initial promotional home and seeking the independence that his commercial value warranted, and that the alternative reading presents as a more instructive illustration of the specific power dynamics of the boxing business and of what happens when the commercially most valuable property in a promotional ecosystem decides it is valuable enough to capture more of its own value. He left Golden Boy in 2020, signing with Matchroom Boxing and Eddie Hearn for the DAZN deal. The split was acrimonious. Oscar de la Hoya, whose relationship with Álvarez had been the commercial foundation of Golden Boy's rise as a promotional force, made various public statements about the departure that combined personal grievance with specific accusations about the management of the relationship. The specific details of the split, the contractual arguments, the accusations about the terms of the promotional relationship during the Golden Boy years were litigated in various forms in public and in court, and produced a level of visibility into the financial architecture of the Canelo commercial property that the promotional narrative would normally have preferred to keep private. The green belt, the WBC's Diamond Championship belt, which is a special designation the WBC created as a kind of prestige honorific above its standard championship titles, and which Canelo has received on multiple occasions, is a small but precise illustration of the specific institutional relationship that the alternative reading of the career identifies as most significant. The Diamond Championship is not a standard championship designation recognized by any athletic commission or any independent boxing authority. It is a creation of the WBC, awarded at the discretion of the organization. The specific criteria for its award and the specific process by which those criteria are assessed are not publicly documented in a way that allows independent evaluation. It has been awarded to Canelo on multiple occasions in contexts where the promotional and commercial benefit to the narrative of his career was apparent. The alternative reading does not claim that the green belt is meaningless. It claims that the green belt means exactly what it is: a designation created by an organization that is financially dependent on the commercial ecosystem the designee anchors, awarded in circumstances that benefit the narrative of a career whose commercial value the organization depends on. That is a different thing from meaning nothing. It is also a different thing from meaning what the promotional narrative claims it means. Ryan Garcia is a 25-year-old Californian fighter whose relationship to the Canelo career is instructive in a specific way that has nothing to do with their having fought each other. Garcia trained for several years in the Canelo camp under Eddie Reynoso and was, for a period, presented in the promotional narrative as the heir apparent, the next Mexican-American boxing star being developed by the infrastructure that had developed Canelo, Garcia's subsequent career, the split from Reynoso, the controversies, the positive drug test before the Devin Haney fight in 2024, is a story whose specific details are not the point here. The point is what the relationship between Garcia and the Canelo camp illustrates about the ecosystem. The way that the infrastructure built around Canelo generates additional commercial properties. The way that the promotional apparatus extends its reach by developing fighters within the orbit of its primary commercial asset. And the specific dependencies this creates between the satellite fighters and the commercial center of the ecosystem. Garcia was not simply a fighter who trained in the same gym. He was a commercial property being developed within the ecosystem whose value was enhanced by the association and whose trajectory was shaped by the same institutional logic. The Caleb Plant unification fight in November 2021 deserves more careful examination than the promotional narrative provides. Plant was the IBF super middleweight champion, and the fight was a genuine unification. The winner would hold all 4 major super middleweight titles simultaneously. A genuine historical achievement. Plant was 29 years old with a genuine professional record of genuine quality, and he brought to the fight a skill set. The jab, the movement, the specific defensive quality that had allowed him to unify from a lower commercial profile than the fighters the promotional apparatus typically produces. That was a genuine competitive test in the early rounds. The pre-fight altercation at the press conference, in which the two fighters physically engaged during a stare down, with Canelo landing a punch to Plant's face while cameras rolled, generated significant coverage and served the promotional function of building the fight's narrative tension. Plant won several rounds in the early portion of the fight. The 11th round stoppage that ended it was legitimate and reflected the specific physical and technical advantage that Canelo holds over Plant in close-range exchanges. What the fight also demonstrated, for the analysts who examined it carefully, was the style of opponent, the jab and move fighter, the fighter who controls distance, that most consistently gives Canelo competitive difficulty. And the specific extent to which Plant, while genuinely good, was not as threatening in that regard as Bivol would subsequently be. The Miguel Cotto fight in November 2015 was made at a catch weight of 155 pounds, 3 pounds below the junior middleweight limit, a weight that required Cotto to come in below his natural fighting weight for a fight in which Canelo, a natural middleweight, was already the larger man. Cotto was 35 years old. He had been fighting at the elite level since 2001. He was, at the time of the fight, a genuinely accomplished professional fighter with genuine championship credentials, and the fight was a genuine competitive test in the sense that it was not a mismatch on paper. It was also a fight made at a weight that advantaged the younger, larger fighter. Canelo won by a unanimous decision that the majority of ringside observers considered accurate. The win is real. The conditions under which it was produced are part of the honest accounting of what the win represents. The Gennady Golovkin fights are the most debated sequence in the Canelo career, and the sequence that contains the most information about what he actually is and what the machinery around him actually does. Golovkin, known universally as GGG, was, at the time of their first fight in September 2017, one of the most feared punchers in boxing, a Kazakh middleweight who had unified the middleweight championship belts and had a professional record of 37 wins and 0 losses with 33 knockouts, and who had been trying to make the Canelo fight for years. The promotional resistance to making the fight, the years during which Golovkin was the most avoided fight in boxing, the specific negotiating obstacles that the Canelo side raised to prevent the fight from being made, is a documented feature of the pre-fight period that the promotional narrative prefers not to engage with. because it reflects the specific competitive risk assessment that the promotional side was making. Golovkin was genuinely dangerous, the fight was genuinely risky, and the construction of the obstacles was a mechanism for managing that risk. The first fight ended in a split draw, a result that the majority of people who watched the fight and scored it round by round found to be inaccurate, with the consensus in ringside scoring giving the fight to Golovkin by 3 to 5 rounds. One judge scored it 118 to 110 for Canelo, a score that was so far from the consensus assessment of the fight that the Nevada State Athletic Commission subsequently reviewed Judge Adelaide Bird's scoring and suspended her from judging title fights for a period following the controversy. The draw was the official result. The commercial apparatus moved on. The rematch was made and then postponed by the clenbuterol controversy, and was eventually contested in September 2018 in the aftermath of the 6-month suspension. And Canelo won on a majority decision in a fight that was again scored differently by the majority of ringside observers, who gave the fight to Golovkin by a smaller margin than the first fight, but still by a majority of rounds. The trilogy fight in September 2022 produced a Canelo knockout in the 6th round, at a point in Golovkin's career when the Kazakh was 40 years old and visibly diminished from the fighter he had been in 2017 and 2018. The Sergey Kovalev fight in November 2019 was the fight that the Canelo promotional narrative presents as one of its signature moments. The move up to light heavyweight to challenge Kovalev's WBO championship, the 11th round knockout in a fight Kovalev had been winning on the cards. The visual spectacle of a super middleweight destroying a light heavyweight champion with a single right hand. The competitive reality of the Kovalev fight is the competitive reality of a 36-year-old fighter who had been damaged by 2 brutal fights with Andre Ward, fights that produced 2 of the most comprehensive beatings in Kovalev's career, and who was, by the time of the Canelo fight, a considerably reduced version of the fighter who had dominated light heavyweight for the previous 5 years. The knockout was real. Kovalev was a genuine champion. The specific competitive quality of what Kovalev was at that precise moment in his career, what remained of the reflexes and the chin and the recovery capacity that had made him dangerous, is the context that makes the knockout significance as a demonstration of Canelo's ability less clear than the promotional presentation suggests. The David Benavidez question is the question that the alternative reading of the Canelo career considers most significant, and that the promotional apparatus has managed with the greatest institutional sophistication. David Benavidez is a 27-year-old super middleweight from Phoenix, Arizona, who has been the WBC mandatory challenger for the super middleweight championship, Canelo's championship, since approximately 2021. The WBC mandatory challenger is, under the rules of the WBC, the fighter who is entitled to a mandatory championship shot. The organization's rules state that a champion must fight their mandatory challenger or vacate the championship. Canelo has not fought Benavidez. He has not vacated the championship. Instead, he has fought other opponents in the super middleweight division, opponents whose risk profile was lower than Benavidez's. While the mandatory situation was managed through the specific mechanisms that the WBC makes available to its champions for extending the window before the mandatory must be met, Benavidez has said publicly, repeatedly, and in terms that have become increasingly direct across the years of the avoidance, that Canelo will not fight him. Canelo's side has offered various explanations. The fight has not been made. I want to stop here and examine the Bivol situation in the specific detail it deserves, because the loss to Bivol in May 2002 and the rematch that has been discussed since are the clearest available window into the specific dynamic between what Canelo is as a fighter and what the machinery around him is as a commercial operation. Because the loss to Bivol was not a close loss. It was not a loss that the judging obscured. It was a loss that almost everyone who watched the fight scored the same way, in which a fighter who was widely regarded as one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world was methodically handled by a light heavyweight champion who fought the fight that the analysts had predicted would. Beat Canelo before the fight started, and what happened after that loss, the management of the rematch conversation, the fights that were made instead, the specific commercial and competitive logic of the choices, tells you more about the Canelo operation than almost any other single chapter of the career. Stay with me. Dmitry Bivol is a 33-year-old Russian light heavyweight champion whose professional record before the Canelo fight was 19 wins and 0 losses, with 11 knockouts, and whose competitive accomplishments, while genuine, had not made him a figure of significant commercial profile in the American boxing market. He was not the Canelo fight that the promotional apparatus had been building toward. He was a fight that Canelo's team chose, in the assessment of most boxing analysts at the time, as a manageable risk. A quality opponent whose name provided the fight with legitimacy, but who was not expected, based on the available evidence, to present the specific competitive problems that would expose the vulnerabilities in Canelo's game. The fight itself was one of the most comprehensively one-sided major championship fights in recent boxing history. Bivol used his jab to control distance from the opening bell and maintain that control across 12 rounds with a consistency and a physical authority that Canelo could not overcome. He moved laterally around the ring, away from Canelo's power, resetting and re-engaging from positions that denied Canelo the close-range opportunities where his offense generates its most dangerous output. He landed the right hand with a timing that repeatedly caught Canelo as he tried to close the distance, and he absorbed the shots that Canelo did land with a physical resilience that suggested the weight class differential was a genuine competitive factor rather than the surmountable challenge that the promotional narrative had implied. The judges who scored it for Bivol gave it 115 to 113, a margin that reflected the genuine quality of the rounds Canelo did win. While confirming the directional clarity of the competitive result, the boxing community's independent scoring, conducted by journalists and analysts who had no commercial relationship with either side, was less close than the official margins. Bivol won. He won clearly enough that the promotional narrative's subsequent management of the result, the framing of the defeat as a close fight at a challenging weight, the elevation of the Bivol rematch conversation as the unfinished business that the career now required, was the specific mechanism of damage control that a commercially dependent narrative apparatus deploys when the product has been undeniably exposed. The vulnerabilities that Bivol exposed were not new vulnerabilities. They were vulnerabilities that the more careful analysts of the Canelo game had been identifying across the later stages of his career. Specifically, the difficulty he has against fighters who box from the outside with consistent movement, who have the jab to control distance, and who have the physical attributes to prevent him from getting to the range at which his offense is most effective. The Mayweather loss in 2013, 23-year-old Canelo versus the best defensive fighter of the modern era, had exposed the same set of vulnerabilities. The critical reading of the Golovkin fights had noted that Golovkin's willingness to stand and trade rather than to box from the outside was part of what had made those fights as competitive for Canelo as they were, that a more mobile Golovkin, exploiting the same vulnerabilities Bivol would later exploit might have produced a cleaner competitive result. Bivol was mobile, Bivol had the jab, Bivol moved consistently and well across 12 rounds, and Canelo, at 31, moving up to light heavyweight against a natural light heavyweight, was not able to cut off the ring or get inside with the consistency that his offense requires. The rematch conversation that followed the Bivol loss was a conversation that the Canelo promotional narrative needed to happen, but that the competitive logic of the situation made commercially unattractive. A rematch with Bivol, a second fight against the fighter who had just beaten him clearly, was the fight that the sporting logic of the situation suggested was next. The immediate rematch, the chance to correct the competitive deficit that the first fight had exposed. The commercial logic of the situation suggested something different. A Canelo loss generates less pay-per-view revenue than a Canelo win. A Canelo rematch with a fighter who had beaten him clearly and who had demonstrated the specific style that gave Canelo the most competitive difficulty carried a specific probability of producing a second loss. A second loss at that stage of the career would accelerate the commercial devaluation of the property in ways that the promotional apparatus was not prepared to manage. He fought Gennady Golovkin in September 2022. The trilogy fight, the opponent he had already beaten twice, now 40 years old, now visibly diminished, instead of the Bivol rematch. He knocked out Golovkin in the 6th round. The promotional narrative presented the knockout as the punctuation on the trilogy, as the definitive statement of competitive superiority over the fighter who had provided his most significant competitive tests. The alternative reading presented it as the management of the commercial property through the choice of an opponent whose risk profile had been substantially reduced by age and by the previous losses in the trilogy. Both readings contain accurate information. The promotional reading does not contain complete information. The Jermell Charlo fight in September 2003 was the fight that produced the second professional loss of the Canelo career, and that the boxing world discussed with a specific combination of genuine surprise and retrospective inevitability that a competitive result contains, whether it is simultaneously unexpected and consistent with what the analytical community had been saying about the fighter's vulnerabilities. Charlo, the unified super welterweight champion, moving up 2 weight classes to challenge Canelo at super middleweight, was considered by many observers to be overmatched on the basis of the weight class differential and Canelo's established competitive record at the division. The fight was not as clear as those observers had predicted. Charlo performed well enough in several rounds to make the fight genuinely competitive, and the majority decision for Canelo. In a fight, the majority of ringside observers scored for Canelo, though by a smaller margin than the promotional narrative would have preferred, was accepted as a legitimate result. What the fight demonstrated, alongside the Bivol loss, was a competitive profile that was more vulnerable to certain styles than the promotional narrative had acknowledged. The question of legacy, of where Canelo Álvarez stands in the historical ranking of great fighters, is a question that the record produces and that the honest answer to requires holding together several things simultaneously. He has won genuine fights against genuine opposition. The wins over Cotto and the first Golovkin fight and the Plant knockout are wins against genuinely good fighters in genuinely competitive circumstances. He has shown in those fights technical qualities, the left hook to the body, the right hand timing, the defensive reflexes in close that are characteristic of elite boxing skill. He has built a career at the commercial peak of the sport across a period of more than 15 years, which requires a quality of professional management and mental discipline that is itself a genuine accomplishment. He has also had 2 losses in big fights, the Mayweather loss and the Bivol loss, that the promotional narrative has worked systematically to contextualize and diminish. He has avoided fights with Benavidez most prominently that the competitive logic of his position required him to take, and that the commercial logic of the property's management suggested he should not. He has operated within a sanctioning body environment, specifically his relationship with the WBC and its president Mauricio Suleiman, that has provided structural advantages in mandatory challenger management, in weight manipulation, and in the specific conditions under which his championship defenses have been made that the champions who operate without equivalent institutional support do not receive. The relationship between Canelo Álvarez and the WBC is the most significant structural feature of his career that the promotional narrative does not engage with directly. The WBC is the World Boxing Council, one of the 4 major sanctioning bodies that govern professional boxing. And it is the organization that has certified the majority of Canelo's championship claims and that has managed his mandatory challenger situations in ways that the critics of his career have documented with increasing specificity across the years. The WBC's president, Mauricio Suleiman, has been publicly and consistently supportive of Canelo, characterizing his championship reign in terms that reflect the promotional narrative rather than the competitive analysis, providing public statements in the context of the clenbuterol case that aligned with Canelo's defense rather than with the anti-doping organization's position, and managing the mandatory challenger situation in ways that have deferred the Benavidez fight that the organization's own rules would appear to require. The WBC's financial relationship with the Canelo commercial ecosystem, the sanctioning fees paid by the promoters of Canelo's championship defenses to the WBC for the organization's certification of the fights, creates the specific conflict of interest that the alternative reading of the career identifies as the most important institutional context for understanding how the record has been shaped. Sanctioning bodies in professional boxing are not independent regulators in the sense that athletics governing bodies in Olympic sports are independent regulators. They are private organizations whose primary revenue stream is the fees they charge for certifying championship fights, which means their financial health is substantially dependent on the continued commercial viability of the champions whose championships they certify. The specific incentive structure this creates incentives toward managing mandatory situations in ways that protect the commercial viability of the champion, incentives toward finding anti-doping explanations that allow the champion's career to continue, incentives toward interpreting the rules of championship succession in ways that favor the commercially valuable champion, is an incentive structure that does not require any specific corrupt act to produce systematic bias. It is bias built into the structural relationship between the organization and its most commercially important client. The media environment that covers Canelo is a media environment substantially organized around the promotional ecosystem he sustains. The broadcasters who carry his fights, DAZN, Showtime, and now Prime Video, are broadcasters who have paid significant sums for the right to carry those fights and who have the specific commercial interest that content rights holders have in the ongoing commercial viability of the content. They have paid for the analysts and commentators who appear on those broadcasts are professionals whose access to the sport at the level at which they operate is mediated through their relationships with the promoters and broadcasters, whose platforms provide them with that access. The boxing journalists who write about Canelo for the major boxing media outlets exist in a professional environment in which sustained critical analysis of the sport's commercially most important property carries. Specific professional risks to access to relationships, to the continued ability to operate at the level of the sport where the interesting stories happen. These are not excuses for uncritical coverage. They are the structural context that explains why the coverage has been as uncritical as it has been, and why the alternative reading of the career has been produced primarily by independent analysts and critics. Outside the mainstream boxing media ecosystem, the specific courage required to maintain a critical analytical position on Canelo within the mainstream boxing media, to report the Benavidez avoidance honestly, to score the Golovkin fights accurately, to assess the clenbuterol case with the rigor that the anti-doping context requires, is courage that the structural incentives of the professional environment actively discourage. The system is not designed to produce honest assessment of Canelo. The system is designed to produce content that sustains the commercial property. Understanding that distinction is the beginning of reading the coverage honestly. The specific financial scale of the Canelo commercial property, the pay-per-view revenues, the streaming rights, the sponsorship deals, the promotional partnerships, has created an ecosystem of financial dependence on the continued viability of the Canelo brand that extends across the boxing business in ways that make honest, competitive analysis of the career not simply inconvenient but financially threatening to specific institutions and individuals. De La Hoya's Golden Boy Promotions is worth considerably more with Canelo than without him. DAZN's investment in American boxing is substantially anchored to the Canelo property. The WBC's financial relationship with the super middleweight championship ecosystem is substantially dependent on the commercial viability of the champion. The trainers, managers, sparring partners, camp personnel, and the entire logistical infrastructure of his operation exists because the commercial property sustains them. The scale of what depends on the continued construction of the Canelo legend is the scale that makes the construction so persistent and so well resourced. Eddie Reynoso, the trainer who has worked with Canelo since his teenage years and who has been credited by the promotional narrative as the primary architect of the technical development that has made him great, is a figure whose role in the career is genuine and whose specific contribution to the fighter's technical development is real. The combination punching, the body attack, the specific refinements in the defensive work that distinguish the Canelo of 2019 and 2021 from the Canelo of 2013. These are developments that reflect genuine coaching of genuine quality applied to genuine physical talent. They are also developments that occurred within the framework of an opponent selection strategy that provided the developmental fights needed to build those skills without the competitive tests that would have exposed the remaining vulnerabilities before they could be addressed. The coaching was real. The environment in which the coaching worked was managed. So, legend or fraud? The honest answer is that the binary is wrong. Canelo Álvarez is a genuinely talented fighter whose specific physical gifts, the hand speed, the reflexes, the power in both hands, the specific quality of the left hook to the body that has stopped multiple opponents are real and are the product of genuine athletic ability combined with genuine professional development over a genuinely long career. He is also a commercial product whose management has been conducted with a sophistication and a thoroughness that has shaped the competitive record in ways that serve the commercial interests of the property at the expense of the competitive clarity that the historical record should contain. The legend is real. The construction of the legend is also real. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the space between them is the space where the honest assessment of the career lives. The fights he did not take, Benavidez, in the form he is in now, the immediate Bivol rematch in the aftermath of a clear defeat, are the fights that the honest record requires noting. The fights he did take, Mayweather at 23, the first Golovkin fight in a genuinely uncertain competitive situation, the plant unification, are the fights that the honest record also requires noting. The career is not a fraud, it is not a pure construction, and it is not, by the standard of the historical assessment it is being asked to claim, the unambiguous greatness that the promotional narrative asserts. Saul Alvarez Barragan, born July 18th, 1990, in Guadalajara, Jalisco, the youngest of 8 children. The red hair, the gym at 13, the professional debut at 15 against opponents who were never going to tell him what he actually was. The Mayweather loss, the clenbuterol test, the Golovkin controversies, the Bivol defeat, the knockouts of Kovalev and Plant, and the 6th round finish of a diminished Golovkin at 40. The avoided fight with Benavides, the $365 million contract, the unified super middleweight championship, the pound-for-pound ranking that was the official consensus of the boxing establishment for 5 consecutive years. The loss that restarted the conversation, all of it is in the record. The question is whether you read the record the way the promotional apparatus has taught you to read it, or whether you read it with the specific information that this documentary has been trying to provide. The legend is available, the fraud is available, the truth is somewhere in the uncomfortable middle where most honest assessments of great complicated careers end up. The cultural dimension of what Canelo represents, what he means to Mexican boxing, to Mexican national identity, to the specific community of boxing fans who have organized their relationship with the sport around his career, is a dimension that the purely competitive analysis risks obscuring, and that the honest account of the career requires acknowledging. Mexico has a boxing tradition of extraordinary richness and depth, a tradition that runs from Julio Cesar Chavez and Eric Morales and Marco Antonio Barrera and Juan Manuel Marquez through to the current generation, a tradition organized around specific values of courage and forward pressure and the specific quality of toughness that the Mexican boxing style celebrates and demands. Canelo is the commercial pinnacle of that tradition. He is the fighter who has taken what Mexican boxing produces and built around it the largest individual commercial property the sport has ever generated. The pride that the Mexican boxing community has invested in him is real and is not simply the product of promotional manipulation. He has given that community something to be proud of. He has done it in the ring, and he has done it in the specific quality of his longevity at the commercial peak of the sport, which is itself a form of achievement that requires qualities, discipline, professionalism, the willingness to continue competing at the highest level across a career of more than 20 years, that the purely competitive analysis does not always credit with the weight they deserve. The specific competitive record of what he has done deserves the honest examination that pride sometimes makes difficult. Both of those things are true. The pride is real. The record is what it is. And the honest assessment of the career requires holding both of those things simultaneously without allowing either to cancel the other. This is the celebrity code. And the code, once you see it, cannot be unseen.